For decades, Princess Anne held her silence. But on a storm-lashed night at Balmoral, behind the oak doors of a private drawing room, she finally confided the unthinkable, a secret prophecy made by the Queen Mother about a woman yet to rise. That woman, Anne declared, was Catherine. What had been buried in royal shadows was now erupting into daylight. And nothing, not even Charles, could stop what was coming. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began not with a royal statement, but a quiet message sent through a trusted equerry, a summons from Princess Anne to several senior aides and confidants, requesting their presence at Balmoral after dusk. They arrived without ceremony, unsure of the purpose, but quickly understood this was no routine engagement. Anne, often dubbed the most stoic of royals, had an unusual tension in her gaze. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, her movements purposeful. Once assembled, she stood before them and uttered words that immediately shifted the air. "Tonight, I speak of a vow made to a dying woman, one that I've carried in silence for over 20 years. There was an audible stillness in the room. Anne didn't pace, didn't dramatize. Instead, she pulled from a locked drawer an envelope sealed with a faded crest. Her hand hovered over it as she continued, revealing that the woman in question was none other than Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The letter had remained untouched since her final days. What she described next stunned those listening. She spoke of a prophecy, less prediction, more declaration made by the Queen Mother in her final hours. It centered not on Charles, nor William, but Catherine. The Queen Mother, she said, foresaw a collapse within the modern monarchy, a fracture so severe only an emissary, outsider with innate regality could mend it. Anne explained that she had protected this revelation fiercely, even from her own brother, out of loyalty and caution. But now, as tensions rose inside the palace and the public shifted toward Catherine with reverence, she could no longer deny that the signs had begun to manifest. With a heavy pause, Anne held the envelope aloft and declared the chilling phrase, "It begins now." Gasps were stifled. No one moved. She wasn't asking permission. She was issuing a reckoning. For those in the room, it was no longer a question of loyalty, it was a question of survival, of protecting the monarchy from itself. The prophecy was no longer a myth. It was about to become a living force. But to understand why Anne waited until now, we must return to a forgotten moment, a dying whisper from a royal matriarch that shaped everything to come. In her final days, the Queen Mother was lucid, watchful, and more calculating than anyone knew. Beneath the weight of legacy and fading breath, she summoned only one royal, the daughter she trusted most, not to comfort her, but to warn her. And in that candlelit chamber, with death lingering, a prophecy was spoken, one that would change the fate of the monarchy. It was the spring of 2002, and the world believed the Queen Mother to be fading peacefully, surrounded by her memories and the silent reverence of a nation. But behind the thick walls of her private quarters at Royal Lodge, something far more deliberate was unfolding. Late one evening, she dismissed all attendants, requesting that Princess Anne come to her alone. The request raised no alarm. Mother and daughter had always shared a quiet understanding, a bond forged in restraint. But when Anne entered that room, she immediately sensed this was not a farewell. It was a warning wrapped in royal code. The Queen Mother, frail but alert, wasted no time. Her voice, though softened by age, cut through the silence with precision. She spoke, not of the past, but of a future she claimed was already trembling beneath its own crown. Anne listened, confused, as her mother described a moment that had not yet come, a fracture at the very core of the monarchy. Not a political scandal, not a family feud, but a slow, dangerous erosion of its spiritual authority. A collapse not of tradition, but of purpose. "There will come a woman," she said, "not of our blood, but with the crown in her soul, and she will be denied, dismissed, and diminished. But if she is broken, so too shall the realm be lost." Anne froze, sensing the gravity but uncertain of its target. She asked who the woman was, but the Queen Mother refused to name her. Instead, she described signs, symbols that would emerge when the time drew near. The swan will fall silent, the crown will divide, and the people will look not to the throne, but to the one who walks beside it. It was not prophecy in the mythical sense. It was instruction, a directive for Anne to recognize when the moment arrived and to act, not as a royal, but as a guardian of the institution's future. Before she closed her eyes that night, the Queen Mother produced a small parchment, sealed with her personal crest. She handed it to Anne with a simple command: protect it until the time reveals her. No explanation, no fanfare, just trust, placed into the only daughter who had never played games with power. Anne, though shaken, accepted it with the same composure that had defined her public life. But inside, she knew something immense had just been placed into her care, something that could upend everything the monarchy stood upon. And so the years passed, with Anne guarding the parchment, the memory, and the unease. She watched as the monarchy evolved, fractured, and rebuilt itself. But none of it, not even the abdications of duty or whispers of scandal, matched what the Queen Mother described. Not until Catherine. Not until the signs began to appear unspoken, undeniable. And when they did, Anne realized the prophecy was no longer dormant. It was alive, moving through time with Catherine as its pulse. But Anne left that room shaken, carrying a prophecy and a burden, one that she would shield until the cracks became too deep to ignore. No Charles, no Queen, no courtiers, just Anne and the matriarch. That was the Queen Mother's final command. The request had raised quiet questions behind palace doors, but none dared challenge it. It was a parting known only to two women bonded not by emotion, but by an unspoken code of duty. When Anne entered the room, she didn't meet the fading face of a grandmother longing for comfort. She encountered a sovereign strategist with one last move to make, and that move would change the course of the monarchy forever. Anne approached her mother's bedside with reverence, but what followed was not the gentle goodbye she'd expected. The Queen Mother, composed despite her failing body, fixed Anne with a gaze, sharper than age should allow. Her voice was deliberate, low but unwavering. She did not ask Anne to mourn. She asked her to listen carefully. What she shared next was nothing short of staggering. She spoke of a coming fracture, a future in which the monarchy would stand on the brink of losing its legitimacy, not to war, nor scandal, but to spiritual erosion. The throne, she warned, would endure a battle not of crowns but of character. And at its heart would be a woman the monarchy would not accept, at least not at first. She called her a commoner with a regal soul, someone unshaped by royal blood but born with royal bearing. Anne remained silent, stunned by the clarity and intensity of what she was hearing. Her mother described the woman's arrival as a quiet storm, a presence both dismissed and underestimated. But she warned that this woman would face brutal resistance, especially from one already within the walls. The Queen Mother, without naming names, spoke of a bitter queen who would try to crush her before she blooms. Anne needed no clarification. The portrait was unmistakable. Then came the moment that sealed Anne's fate in this narrative. The Queen Mother reached beneath her pillow and retrieved a sealed parchment, its wax seal bearing her personal crest, a lion framed in thistle. She placed it in Anne's hand with words that would echo in her mind for decades. Guard this until the heir's hour. No date, no specific instruction, just a demand steeped in faith and mystery. Anne accepted it, not fully understanding, but knowing that once the Queen Mother passed, this prophecy and its consequences would belong to her alone. She didn't speak of this encounter again, not to the Queen, not to Charles. She locked the parchment in a private vault and buried the memory under years of silence. But in the corners of her mind, she watched, waited, measured every royal shift through the lens of that night. Surface, when the bitterness turned toward Catherine, and the people's hearts began to follow her instead, Anne knew. The hour was no longer far off. It was approaching, fast and undeniable. Anne left that room shaken, carrying a prophecy and a burden, one that she would shield until the cracks became too deep to ignore. She was never meant to survive the storm. Catherine, the outsider, the wife of the heir. But as her presence blossomed, so did resentment. Especially from one woman, Camilla. Behind palace walls, a cold war brewed, as Catherine unknowingly stepped deeper into the path the Queen Mother had foretold, and Camilla would do anything to erase it. In the years following her marriage, Catherine emerged as a beacon of modern grace. With each appearance, each speech, each quiet moment captured by the public eye, she seemed to embody a dignity that transcended protocol. She didn't chase the spotlight, it found her. Crowds gathered in numbers unseen since Diana. Her calm, strength, her warmth, her authenticity. They stirred something in the people that couldn't be manufactured. And that was precisely the problem. Because within the palace, admiration quickly turned to unease, and the one who felt it most deeply, most bitterly, was Camilla. While Charles leaned heavily on Camilla behind closed doors, her grip over public affection never matched her status. That frustration simmered for years, but it boiled over the moment Catherine's star began to rise uncontrollably. The media lauded her every move. International dignitaries remarked on her poise. Charitable organizations found new life under her patronage. And with each glowing headline, Camilla's influence grew more brittle. Anne noticed it first, not in statements, but in shadows. Certain invitations rescinded. Projects Catherine had been poised to lead, suddenly reassigned. Patronages she'd nurtured quietly redirected under Camilla's name. It was never overt, always veiled, but unmistakable. Whispers grew louder among palace aides, accounts of passive-aggressive remarks, subtle scheduling conflicts, and orchestrated absences. There's tension between the royal women, one staffer reportedly leaked to a tabloid. But behind that careful phrase was a silent war. Catherine didn't retaliate, she endured. And in that endurance, Anne saw something rare, familiar. The quiet resilience of someone marked by destiny. The prophecy that had once felt like a myth began to pulse beneath Anne's skin. Each interaction between Catherine and Camilla echoed the Queen Mother's warning. The bitter queen, the regal soul. The pieces were aligning. As Catherine's popularity soared past Camilla's, a silent panic set in among the inner circle. Camilla's allies began speaking in urgent tones. Strategies were drafted to reinforce the hierarchy. The monarchy, they insisted, could not afford confusion over seniority. But Anne, who had seen more royal cycles than most, knew this wasn't about seniority, it was about survival. The people had made their choice long before the institution realized it. And with each passing week, Catherine was no longer just the wife of the heir, she was becoming the heartbeat of the crown. Anne remained silent, watching, waiting. The prophecy was no longer distant. It was threading itself through the cracks of the monarchy, and only those willing to look beyond protocol could see it. She wasn't ready to reveal what she carried. Not yet. But every move Camilla made, every act of quiet sabotage, only sharpened Anne's awareness that the Queen Mother's words were unfolding with devastating accuracy. The storm wasn't coming, it was already here. And Catherine had not only survived it, she was redefining its very course. But then, the first signal came not from Catherine, but from the people. And from the archives Anne had hidden away. Hidden in a velvet pouch beneath Anne's private vault at Gatcombe, it had remained, untouched for over 20 years. The Queen Mother's handwritten words, marked with her personal crest, titled Clarion Protocol, a prophecy cloaked in ancient code, spelling out the collapse of a queen and the rise of a woman not born royal. It was Charles's sudden health scare that shattered Anne's long-standing restraint. For years, she had guarded the sealed parchment as a sacred relic, kept in a reinforced drawer that no aide, no assistant, had ever accessed. But with rumours swirling around the king's condition, his pallor, his cancelled meetings, the silence from Clarence House, Anne felt the shift. The hour the Queen Mother had warned of was no longer theoretical, it had arrived. And so, without ceremony, Anne unlocked the vault, removed the pouch, and stared at the faded seal with hands that trembled for the first time in decades. What lay inside was not a traditional letter, but a document laced with symbolism and veiled instruction. Titled Clarion Protocol, it read like scripture disguised as strategy. The first phrase leapt from the page. When the mist crown dims, the clarion must sound. Anne knew instantly what it meant. The mist crown had always symbolized the monarch's visible strength, and now, with Charles faltering and public faith splintering, that crown had begun to blur. Then came the second sign. The silenced swan shall glide in grief. Anne's breath caught. It was a direct reference to Catherine, known by many as the silent strength of the monarchy, the graceful symbol of composure. The document didn't name her directly, but the meaning was unmistakable. And then the third sign. The gilded air shall dim the room, yet not carry the fire. Anne paused. William? Or someone else? The ambiguity only deepened the tension. But what followed erased all doubt. The Queen Mother referred to the daughter of grace, a phrase repeated several times. She described this figure as one not born to the throne, but called by it, someone whose heart would outweigh her title and whose trials would mirror the nation's unrest. The prophecy warned of a war within the palace, not of weapons, but of favor. False queens will rise, it read, but they shall not endure. Their crowns will glitter, but they will not bind the people. The sentence burned into Anne's mind. It was no longer just a warning, it was a reckoning. She continued reading, absorbing every coded passage, every poetic but pointed instruction. And when she finished, Anne wept. Not out of fear, but from the haunting accuracy of what had been laid out before her decades ago. The events of the last 5 years, the tension, the sabotage, the rise of Catherine's voice, and the subtle erosion of Camilla's standing were no longer coincidences. They were confirmations. The Queen Mother hadn't guessed. She had foreseen. And Anne, in her loyalty, had done exactly what she'd been asked, waited for the signs. Still, Anne knew that opening the document and accepting its message was only the beginning. A prophecy is nothing without its catalyst, and though she now held the key, the door could not be unlocked by her alone. The Clarion Protocol had made one thing excruciatingly clear. The crown would not bend for declarations or decrees. It would bend when the people saw the soul of the realm reflected in one woman's quiet courage. That moment had not yet come, but Anne could feel it stirring just beneath the surface of Catherine's poised exterior. But Anne knew she couldn't act alone. She needed a signal from Catherine herself that the prophecy's time had arrived. When Catherine appeared at Westminster in a sapphire ensemble once worn by the Queen Mother herself, royal watchers called it a style homage. But to Anne, it was something else. An echo, a silent declaration, a message only those who knew the prophecy would understand. And with that gesture, the daughter of grace awakened the prophecy's next phase. The event itself had been routine, another ceremonial occasion masked in pageantry. Yet from the moment Catherine stepped out wearing the Queen Mother's iconic sapphire brooch, a piece long believed to have been retired to the vaults, there was a quiet murmur that rippled through the crowd. To the public, it was tasteful, thoughtful, a nod to history. But for Anne, who had once held that very brooch in her own hands as her mother took it off for the last time, it was nothing short of a signal. An awakening. The brooch had not simply been chosen. It had been summoned. Camilla, standing just feet away during the ceremony, noticed it too. Her expression, captured briefly by the cameras, faltered. The smile weakened. The posture stiffened. She understood the symbolism, or at least enough of it to feel the tremor. It was more than a brooch. It was an inheritance of intention, a sign that Catherine was not merely navigating royal life, but stepping directly into the shadow cast by the Queen Mother's last words. Camilla knew she had not been named in any prophecy, not protected by any ancient hand. Catherine had been. And now, she had made it visible. The tabloids, as expected, rushed to frame it as a fashion statement, Kate's sapphire tribute, with headlines spinning tales of elegance and tradition. But Anne saw beyond the optics. The moment Catherine returned to Kensington that night, Anne acted. For the first time in years, she reached out directly, requesting a private audience. No staff, no intermediaries, just the two of them. Catherine arrived unsure, unaware of the enormity waiting to be unveiled. Anne wasted no time. She spoke not as an aunt, but as a sentinel, a keeper of a prophecy too long buried. She recounted fragments of her mother's final message, careful not to overwhelm but precise enough to change the course of Catherine's perception. The Queen Mother's words, the sealed parchment, the symbolism of the daughter of grace, it all came pouring out in measured waves. Catherine sat silent, absorbing each revelation with widening eyes. She didn't deny it. She didn't deflect. She didn't claim unworthiness. She listened, and though she was visibly shaken, she never stepped back. There were no declarations or vows, but the air between them had changed. Anne saw the moment the weight settled on Catherine's shoulders and the quiet, unflinching way she carried it. That was the power the Queen Mother had predicted, not loud, not forceful, but enduring. Catherine hadn't asked for any of this, but now she understood that what was once dormant inside her had been recognized, and from this moment forward, her every movement would be watched through a different lens. Still, not everyone welcomed this unfolding revelation. The Crown was watching, and Charles was no longer blind to Anne's whispers. What began as an urgent summons turned into a volatile confrontation. Behind closed doors at Clarence House, Charles demanded answers from Anne. What was she doing? Why was Catherine suddenly being groomed for more? And when Anne placed the Clarion Protocol before him, his face paled and then darkened. He called it treason. She called it destiny. The tension had been building for weeks, but the confrontation arrived like thunder. Charles had received word discreet but unmistakable that Anne had been holding private meetings with Catherine, that she had re-entered her niece-in-law's orbit with a deliberate and secretive intensity. And worse, that Catherine's public moves, the sapphire brooch, the sudden confidence, the subtle but symbolic positioning were not accidental. They were calculated. They were coordinated. The king, already battling his own internal unrest, had had enough. Anne was summoned without pleasantry. The moment she stepped inside the private chambers, it was war. Charles began with accusations, veiled at first, then sharp. He demanded to know why Anne was stirring echoes of the past, why she was planting seeds of division in a house already strained by tension. His words came fast, laced with frustration. He claimed she was undermining Camilla, encouraging speculation, destabilizing the very thing their mother had spent her life preserving. But Anne did not flinch. She stood steady, composed, and when he finished, she answered with nothing more than a quiet statement. "It's time you saw this." She handed him the Clarion Protocol, the original document, not a copy, not a summary, the very parchment sealed by the Queen Mother herself. Charles hesitated, then broke the seal. His eyes scanned the coded script, growing darker with each line. He read the signs: the swan, the mist crown, the daughter of grace. He read the Queen Mother's warning: false queens will rise, but they will not endure. And then, without looking up, he whispered, "Is this what you believe? That this prophecy is real?" Anne responded, not with argument, but with conviction. She told him she hadn't believed in fantasy or fairy tales. She had waited, observed, measured, and everything their mother had written was unfolding before them line by line. She wasn't sowing division. She was following instruction, upholding a vow made to a dying woman whose foresight had never failed them before. Charles slammed the document down. "There is no room for mystics and martyrs in this monarchy," he growled. Anne stepped forward, eyes locked on his. "Then you'll lose everything," she said, without blinking. The room fell silent. The air hung heavy with unspoken truths. Neither sibling raised their voice, but the fracture between them was irreversible. Charles could no longer ignore the signs or the threat he believed they posed. Anne could no longer hide behind silence. From that moment on, they stood on opposite ends of a calm, secret battle, one ruled by duty, the other by prophecy. From that moment, a silent line was drawn. The monarchy was split not by blood but by belief. Within the shadowy walls of the Crown Chamber, the monarchy's private advisory council, deep unrest festered. Camilla's allies moved to silence Anne. But whispers had spread. The prophecy, once hidden, now shaped strategic loyalties, and slowly, even senior courtiers began to question, could Catherine truly be the key to saving the monarchy? What had once been dismissed as folklore had now become a force in motion, quietly redrawing the lines of power. The Crown Chamber, a place designed for strategy and containment, had become a theatre of fear. Senior advisors debated not only Anne's growing influence, but also the sudden symbolism attached to Catherine's every move. They questioned why certain briefings were being diverted, why a senior royal was appearing in private talks she had no precedent to attend. Behind the marbled walls, it became clear that Anne's actions were not isolated, they were coordinated. And worse, they were beginning to gain traction among those who had once stayed loyal to the old structure. Camilla, increasingly isolated despite the titles surrounding her name, made her move. She pressed the chamber to limit Catherine's engagements abroad, arguing that protocol dictated the Queen Consort's visibility must remain unchallenged. It wasn't phrased as retaliation, it was dressed in institutional logic. But no one at the table misunderstood its purpose. It was containment, control. And yet, even as this plan was pushed forward, the tides outside the chamber told a different story. William, whose silence had become an enigma of its own, remained deliberately ambiguous. He neither endorsed Anne nor condemned her. When asked privately, he offered only one phrase: "History watches all of us." That was enough to cause unease. If the future king would not defend the current queen, what did that mean for the house itself? Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a confidential memo titled "Clarion Contingency" was leaked to the press. The memo described a theoretical restructuring of ceremonial roles in the event of a monarchical fracture. The media exploded. Theories surged. Was Catherine being prepared for something bigger? Public fascination ignited instantly. Comparisons between Catherine's grace and the Queen Mother's legacy flooded editorials. Talk shows dissected her poise. Her quiet strength was repackaged as revolutionary calm. Royal watchers noted how seamlessly she embodied the traits the monarchy desperately needed, but didn't always recognize. The Clarion Protocol had never been spoken aloud to the public, and yet, somehow, the prophecy had taken on a life of its own. The people could feel its pulse. Amid the storm, Anne gained two unlikely allies. Princess Beatrice, long relegated to the background, stepped forward with surprising resolve. She issued a statement praising Catherine's unshakable sense of duty. And behind the scenes, the Duke of Edinburgh voiced his alignment with Anne, stating in a private memo that legacy must bow to wisdom, not ego. These were not declarations of rebellion, they were acknowledgements of a shift that could no longer be ignored. But as the prophecy tightened its grip, it was Catherine herself who would step forward and change everything. Before an audience of scholars and royal watchers, Catherine took the podium at Rosewood Hall. What was meant to be a lecture on mental health became something else entirely. Without naming the prophecy, she echoed every word. She spoke of ancient legacies, modern courage, and unity forged through grace. It wasn't political. It was transcendent. The event had been planned months in advance, billed as part of Catherine's ongoing commitment to mental health awareness. But behind the scenes, those closest to her knew this address would be different. It came at a time when the monarchy was quietly fracturing, when public faith in its future teetered between nostalgia and necessity. And in the wake of months of speculation, whispers of Anne's rebellion, and the still unspoken Clarion Protocol, Catherine stood before the nation not as a consort, but as a vessel of calm conviction. From the moment she began speaking, it was clear this was not a standard royal engagement. It was a moment of awakening. She didn't speak of crowns. She didn't mention prophecy or power. Instead, she spoke of burden, resilience, and the invisible weight of duty carried not for glory, but for healing. She referenced the quiet strength of those never meant to be seen, and the importance of restoring trust not through command, but through character. Those were not casual phrases. They were direct echoes from the Queen Mother's final writings. Anne, listening from Balmoral, recognized them immediately. So did the few insiders who had seen the Clarion Protocol with their own eyes. Catherine was not revealing the prophecy, she was embodying it. As she continued, the room seemed to shift. The scholars, usually unmoved by palace rhetoric, leaned in, visibly gripped. Advisors and analysts, often skeptical of royal symbolism, found themselves blinking back emotion. Even hardened political commentators would later admit something in the room had changed. Not one reference to Camilla, not one attack, but the message was unmistakable. The past would not be erased, but the future would be earned. Camilla, notably absent from the event, had reportedly been advised against attending. Whether by choice or strategic retreat, her silence only deepened the moment's meaning. Within minutes of the speech ending, clips began circulating across social media. Hashtags erupted. Commentators dubbed it a quiet coronation. Within an hour, headlines from every major outlet echoed the same sentiment. Catherine had stepped into her power. She had done it without force, without scandal, and yet she had ignited something the monarchy hadn't seen in decades: authentic reverence. Then came the statement from William. Brief, but unmistakable. Today, I was not just proud of my wife, I was proud of the future she represents. It was a line no one could ignore, a symbolic endorsement, a nod not just of support, but of alignment. With that single sentence, William signalled where he stood, not beside protocol, but beside purpose. And Anne, alone in her study, watching the broadcast replay in silence, allowed herself a rare smile. It was the first time in months her face had softened, not because the battle was won, but because, for the first time, it had turned. But one final twist remained hidden not in words or actions, but in the Queen Mother's private journal, recently unearthed. Tucked behind royal correspondence, archivists discovered the Queen Mother's personal journal, long thought destroyed. On the final page, in delicate ink, she wrote, "The crown shall bend, but not break. Grace will rise through pain. She will not wear the title first, but she will hold the soul of the realm." And beneath that, the name, Catherine. It was meant to be routine, a cataloguing of old royal documents as part of a larger archiving initiative led by the palace's internal historians. For months, dusty trunks and sealed boxes from the Queen Mother's estate had been quietly processed, logged, and dismissed. But tucked in the folds of an unmarked folder hidden behind state letters and personal note cards lay a slender journal bound in green leather. A tag reading "Private" had faded with time. When opened, it revealed a series of deeply personal reflections. The final entry, written with trembled precision and dated just days before her passing, changed everything. The passage was unlike the rest, poetic, weighty, and unnervingly prescient. It spoke of turmoil, of a monarchy tested by silence and sorrow. The phrase, "Grace will rise through pain," now seemed to point unmistakably to Catherine's recent health ordeal, an affliction the public had mourned and admired her for enduring with dignified quiet. The line, "She will not wear the title first," left even the most skeptical scholars rattled. It aligned too perfectly with Catherine's current standing, beloved by the people, yet not crowned in name. The Queen Mother had not described a position. She had described a presence, a power beneath protocol. A woman who would hold the soul of the monarchy while others held the title. The journal was authenticated immediately. Ink, paper, and handwriting all verified beyond doubt. The palace did not suppress its discovery. Perhaps it couldn't. Perhaps the moment had simply grown too large to contain. Once news of the passage broke, it spread like wildfire. Talk shows, podcasts, editorials each seized on the uncanny alignment between Pleasicus, prophecy, and present. Within 48 hours, petitions began to surface, not demanding a coronation, but something else: recognition, visibility, a formal shift in ceremonial power not through upheaval, but through evolution. And then came the silence from Camilla. No statements, no engagements, no appearances. Insiders whispered of health concerns, of strategic withdrawal, of internal fury. But the effect was undeniable. The Queen Consort, once fiercely positioned as Charles's shield, had begun to recede into the background. Whether by design or necessity, she was no longer the face of the future. That face, increasingly, was Catherine's. Inside the palace, the mood was shifting. Former critics had grown cautious. Longtime allies were now hedging loyalties. Anne had said nothing publicly, but she didn't need to. The journal had said it all. It was the final piece. The prophecy wasn't just real. It was complete. Every line had unfolded in real time, right before the nation's eyes. But even with the Queen Mother's final words now echoing through the corridors of power, one question remained haunting, unshakable. Has Catherine already begun reshaping the monarchy, or is her true rise still to come? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.